grandma or great-great-uncle Giuseppe had this ailment, because a lot of people, especially in those days, believed that a mental illness meant something was wrong with you.
Thank you. I want to make sure in the 10 minutes or so that remain that the audience has the opportunity to ask questions. So please, if you have questions, approach the microphones, and I'm sure Dr. Scarpacci will be glad to answer them. My colleague, Dr. Greer.
I'm just wondering how language, this doesn't seem to be working.
Yeah.
Okay. I was wondering how language retention, if anything that you had done related to that in terms of their native Italian.
I personally haven't done anything on language retention, but across the board, Woodrow Wilson said, we are not hyphenated Americans, we are Americans. America in the early 20th century until almost recently, let's say in the last 40 years, bilingualism was not considered an asset, and you were considered to be non-American if you spoke another language. And it wasn't only the first people, the Native Americans, who were sent to these special schools and were forced to give up their culture. I think many of the immigrants were told that by their teachers in the American public schools. And someone asked me about the language, and I think language is part of your culture. And although I have to admit that my parents did not teach me Italian, because as my mother said to me, I said, why didn't you teach us Italian? And I didn't say this until I was going to college, and a professor said to me, why, don't you know Italian? I said, no. So anyway, I went home and I said to Mom, why didn't you and Dad teach us Italian? Well, it was Sicilian, but still Italian. And she said, because, and this is the only time I heard pain in her voice. She said, because when I went to school, I only knew Sicilian, and the kids made fun of me, and I didn't want you to go through that. And it didn't occur to her that they were bilingual, my mom and dad, and they would have taught me both languages. So it was quite interesting that that continued.
First of all, thank you very much for coming out today. I really appreciate you being here. I know in your speech you mentioned several times about the Italian Council from whom the Italian immigrants would seek assistance. Could you perhaps elaborate on their role in the Italian immigration?
Good question.
Yeah, great question. The immigration agency was a governmental agency in Italy, was concerned for the care of the immigrants wherever they settled, in South America as well as in the United States. And these were people appointed by the authorities in Italy to be to facilitate problems. And sometimes they translated in courts. Sometimes they sent the remittances back to Italy. They helped them to do that. You have to remember that a lot of the immigrants were either completely illiterate or semi-literate. So negotiating in the American system was difficult. Also, my other grandmother, not the one that was institutional, she's my great-grandmother. My great-grandmother went to the Italian consulate because she wanted to go back to Sicily. And he gave her funds because people who were not able to pay their way back to Italy, they would allow that to occur. And then when incidents occurred, like the lynching of 11 Sicilians in New Orleans in 1891 and other kinds of incidents, the consuls went to investigate to see what was going on, to make reports, and also to send complaints, protests to the American law enforcement and the American justice system.
Dr. Wheeler.
I wish I'd written down what you said. You threw out a hint early in your talk about the place of Italian immigrants in the kind of American racial landscape. Something along the lines of being in between black and white, I think. I hope I'm not reading into that. You know, James Lowen has written a book about, for example, about the Chinese in Mississippi playing that kind of role in between in terms of where they went to school, whom they married, et cetera, et cetera. And there's now a whole academic industry on how some European ethnic groups, quote, became white, usually focused on Jews and Irish. But have you come across any of these issues in your research?
Well, my dissertation on Italians in Louisiana goes into detail about this in-between role and how Italians were criticized because they would serve African Americans. Also, in the plantation payroll books, there were 3 categories. There were colored, there were Italians, and there were white workers. Wow. So Italians were neither white nor colored. And in the South, Italians tended to be more accepting at this point of African Americans. And that was an opportunity that a lot of entrepreneurs followed to provide services to the African American population, and they also would employ African Americans. But on the plantations, they lived next to each other, they visited each other, they had a everyday workers community on the plantations. And I would suggest that you read my essay in a book called Are Italian Whites? It's called Walking the Color Line. And I think the Southern experience is different from the Northern experience. And I just can, from a personal point of view, I never check white on government things because I am not white. I am not African American, I am not Asian, I am not Hispanic, but I am not white. I am European, but I usually check, and when they say other, I say Sicilian American. Because we need to respect that all of us come from diverse heritages. And those of us who are multi-ethnic, we get to celebrate them all.
Would you say that the overall experience of the Italian immigrants was any more or less pleasant or unpleasant than other immigrants?
Well, it depends if you introduce race, because Italians were not treated the way Chinese or Japanese were treated.
I was including that. Yes.
Oh, okay, other Europeans. Other Europeans, you mean? Contrast them with other Europeans?
Everyone, just everyone. Like
Yeah,
that.
I'm saying that they were not treated as badly as the Asians were treated here, because the Asians were not even allowed to become American citizens, whereas Italians could become American citizens. But there was a distinction in the immigration rules and regulations for incoming Italians. The Italians were listed as Italians and Southern Italians, and Southern Italians were not considered to be as good as the Northern Italians, who were supposedly more closely connected with the Northern European traditions. And 85% of the Italians who came to the United States were from Southern Italy. So there was this also official distinction between, quote, good Italians and not so good Italians, these Italians who could not assimilate, who could not become good citizens, who didn't come from democratic situations. And so there was this discrimination, but whether it was worse than anybody else, I don't think so, because the Poles were also looked down upon, the Greeks were also looked down upon, all of these groups, especially Southern and Eastern European groups. And in the 1920s, restriction laws were passed to make sure that the United States would no longer get people from this part of the world.
Well, I'm being reminded that
Yes.
it's 10:45. And
you.
I
so,
could talk more out
I'm
there.
quite sure. So Dr. Scarpacci will be in the lobby to sell her books, and she'll probably have the opportunity to answer a couple more questions too. So thank you for coming. And thank you, Dr. Scarpacci.